We left off last time with JFK being assassinated and LBJ taking office. Now on November 27th, 5 days after the assassination, LBJ gave a speech to a joint session of Congress. In that speech he said this, "All I have I would have gladly given not to be standing here today." And in that speech he beseeched Congress and the nation to, quote, "Let us continue the work JFK begun," which LBJ said included education for all our children, jobs for all who seek them, care for our elderly, and equal rights for all Americans, whatever their race or color. LBJ also said, "No memorial or oration or eulogy could more eloquently honor President Kennedy's memory than the earliest possible passage of the Civil Rights Bill for which he fought so long. We have talked long enough about equal rights in this country. We have talked for 100 years or more. It is time now to write the next chapter and write it in the books of laws." Now, LBJ used the memory of JFK to launch his own administration, and JFK was made a martyr in his death. His wife, Jacqueline, with the help of the journalist Theodore White, created this thing called the Myth of Camelot. White wrote a glowing article about JFK as a boy being obsessed with King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Jackie added in the article that his administration had been, quote, "a magic moment in American history, when gallant men danced with beautiful women, when great deeds were done, when artists, writers, and poets met at the White House, and the barbarians beyond the walls held back." Now, JFK's administration had not been Camelot, and JFK was not a martyr for anything like civil rights. He only came around to supporting civil rights late in his administration. If he was a martyr for anything, it was a martyr for the Cold War, as he was assassinated by a communist. So let's talk a little bit about LBJ's early life, and then we'll get into his administration. Now, LBJ was born near Stonewall, Texas on August 27th, 1908. His father was a rough man who was in politics, and he had a populist leaning, and he served in the state legislature in Texas. His mother was a strong-willed woman who often withheld her love from LBJ or would not speak to him when she was disappointed with him. So these actions by his parents really influenced his upbringing. His upbringing would lead many to conclude that he was obsessed with getting people to like him. Many felt he was insecure throughout his life. This came from his mother. His insecurity and his crudeness came from his father. And just to show you what I mean by his crudeness, I've got some quotes. He was famously crude person, LBJ was. Now, LBJ once said regarding the type of person he wanted working for him, he said, quote, "I want someone who will kiss my ass in the Macy's window and stand up and say, 'Boy, wasn't that sweet?'" Another time he told his political aide that they needed to be on Capitol Hill at all times to work with Congress in getting legislation passed. This is how he phrased it: "You got to learn how to mount this Congress like you mount a woman." LBJ was also a very vain person. He once visited the Pope. The Pope gave him a 14th century painting as a gift, and LBJ responded by giving the Pope a bust of himself, a miniature bust. LBJ was also a notorious womanizer. He bragged that he slept with more women than JFK did, and he didn't hide his affairs. His wife was humiliated by this. LBJ also liked to brag about the size of his member and would sometimes show it to others while in the bathroom. He would pull it out and exclaim, "Have you ever seen anything as big as this?" His nickname for his member was Jumbo. So LBJ is a very crude man by anybody's standards. Now, LBJ has a long political career. He comes to Washington in 1931 as a congressional secretary. In 1937, he wins a special election to the House of Representatives. In that election, he supported FDR's court packing plan. LBJ idolized Franklin Roosevelt. So as we study LBJ's presidency, remember that he grew up in the presence of FDR, a president who both fought poverty in the Great Depression and Germany and Japan in World War II. Now, in 1941, LBJ ran for the Democrat nomination for Senate from Texas, one of the seats, but he had the election stolen from him by a man named Pappy Lee O'Daniel. LBJ had won the election for the Democrat nomination, and Texas is a Democrat state, so whoever wins the Democratic primary automatically is going to become senator, because the November of election is a done deal, basically. Newspapers had announced the victory, and people from Washington called to congratulate him. But after a few days, O'Daniel's team forged enough votes to barely pull ahead, so LBJ wins, but the election is stolen from him. LBJ tries again in 1948. He runs for the Senate again. This time he won, defeating Coke Stevenson. LBJ stole this election from Stevenson. LBJ's cronies made sure to find extra votes in some counties. There's a famous photograph of some of them with precinct box 13, which they stuffed with extra votes. LBJ won this election by 87 votes. So when he came to Washington as a senator, people viewed him as illegitimate and gave him the nickname Landslide Lyndon. Now, LBJ is a very tenacious politician and campaigner. While he's campaigning for the Senate, he travels all over the state of Texas. He takes rides in helicopters. He would show up at a small town, land his helicopter, go out and give a speech. He would throw his hat over the crowd, his big cowboy hat, and then one of his aides, when they landed, would have to go find out who had that hat and get it back so he could throw it at the next town. Now, so LBJ is a representative from 1937 to 1949, and then he's a senator throughout the 1950s until he becomes vice president. Now, as a representative and senator, LBJ helped funnel federal money back to Texas to help farmers and the poor. LBJ grew up very poor, so he used the federal government to try and help those in poverty. He supported money for schools, public libraries, roads, electricity, and the dam on the Colorado River. LBJ was an opponent of civil rights. Although a Senate Majority Leader, he did help push through the Civil Rights Act of 1957 and then another one in 1960. But he had it watered down just enough so it wouldn't split the Democrat Party. In 1960, LBJ won election as vice president. Now, these years as vice president were often humiliating. He was used to running the show, and now he was in the background of JFK and his brother Bobby Kennedy. Bobby Kennedy especially hated Lyndon Johnson and would humiliate him whenever he got the chance. Once, LBJ was traveling to Scandinavia, and Bobby sent an uncoded telegram to the embassies ahead of LBJ's arrival that said this: "The Vice President is in no way speaks for the President of the United States and is not to be received as if he were an emissary of the President," so kind of undercutting his authority before he even arrives. But once LBJ becomes president, he gets down to business. One of the first things he did was get JFK's massive tax cuts passed. They were passed in February of 1964, a few months after Kennedy's assassination. Next, LBJ got to work on his war on poverty, something he discussed in his January 1964 State of the Union address. In that address, he had said this: "This administration today, here and now, declares unconditional war on poverty in America." Now, the poverty line in 1964 was estimated to be $3,130 for a family of four and $1,500 for an individual. Now, liberals believed that the United States was rich and that the government could fix things. Think about the New Deal in World War II, massive problems, the Great Depression facing America. The government, many people believed, fixed these problems. LBJ said it best for liberals: "Hell, we're the richest country in the world, the most powerful, we can do it all." Now, here are some things to keep in mind, and I'm going to quote James T. Patterson from Grand Expectations. He says this: "Most of the people defined by the government as poor in the 1960s had central heating, indoor plumbing, and television. Many owned cars. In much of the world, they would have been considered well off. So these poor are not the poor that we talked about during the Great Depression. They're a little bit better off." Another thing I want to point out is that liberals such as Johnson were not radicals. Again, quoting from Grand Expectations, talking about liberals: "They were optimists who reflected the confidence of the contemporary American liberal thought. Unlike radicals, they thought that most poor people needed only a helping hand to rise in life. Unlike conservatives, they had great faith that government could and should extend that hand." So liberals of the 1960s do not support redistributing wealth, but rather programs to help the poor. And you can basically think about the political spectrum. Liberals and kind of moderate Republicans, they want to use the federal government to help people, health insurance, unemployment insurance, stuff like that. Radicals to the left, they want to redistribute wealth, kind of take down American capitalism, institute socialism. So they're to the left. And then on the right, you have conservatives who were kind of traditionally classical liberals who believed keeping the government out of the daily lives of its citizens. It's not the government's job to fix every problem. Let the people fix them themselves. Now, in February 1964, LBJ placed Sergeant Shriver, JFK's brother-in-law, in charge of a poverty bill, and throughout the spring of 1964, it would be worked out. The result was the Economic Opportunity Act, which LBJ signed into law in August of 1964, so this is a huge law to try to help people out economically. It included loans for small businesses and rural development, work-study funding for college students, a domestic Peace Corps called VISTA, which stood for Volunteers in Service to America. It also had something called the Jobs Corps. It called for community action programs, or CAPS, that would allow local leaders to work in concert with Washington to address poverty. It also set up the Office of Economic Opportunity, which initiated things like Head Start and Follow Through. Those were educational programs aimed at children. Another program included was the Neighborhood Legal Services. This gave legal advice to the poor. The Office of Economic Opportunity was given $800 million by Congress. This amounted to roughly $200 per person. One person called this, quote, a skirmish, not a war on poverty, but that's still a lot of money. Now, LBJ also gets to work on civil rights in 1964. JFK had introduced a bill in June of 1963, but then he was assassinated. So LBJ works with Congress to secure its passage. In February 1964, the bill passes the House 290 to 130. Now, Democrats supported the Civil Rights Bill by 61 to 39%. So 61% of Democrats supported the law, 39% opposed it. Republicans supported civil rights 80% to 20%. In the Senate, the bill faced a 3-month filibuster by Democrats, and an important vote for cloture, which shuts off debate, passed the Senate on June 10th by a vote of 71 to 29. So 82% of Republicans supported ending debate so civil rights could be passed, while 66% of Democrats supported ending debate to pass the law. So the final bill passes the Senate 73 to 27, with 82% of Republicans supporting the bill, while 69% of Democrats supported the bill. So the Civil Rights Act of 1964, Republicans supported it, over 80% of Republicans supported it, while about 60% of Democrats supported the Civil Rights Act. So LBJ signs this massive law into effect on July 2nd, and here's what the act did, some of the things. It banned racial discrimination in privately run accommodations for the public. This included things like restaurants, theaters, gas stations, hotels, movie houses. It authorized the Attorney General to eliminate legal segregation in things like public schools, playgrounds, hospitals, libraries, museums, and other public places. So it takes aim at legal segregation. Schools could lose federal funds if they continued to discriminate. The law also included something called Title VII. This forbade discrimination in employment and specified the category of sex in addition to race, color, religion, and national origin. So it's kind of an attempt to end discrimination between men and women. The law also created the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. Though there would be much more accomplished in the coming years regarding civil rights, the Civil Rights Act of 1964 was a major step forward. Illinois Republican Senator Everett Dirksen said this of the law: "No army can withstand the strength of an idea whose time has come. In the history of mankind, there is an inexorable moral force that moves us forward." Now, LBJ could tout his civil rights accomplishments for the upcoming 1964 election. Remember, he basically has 1 year to be president before he has to run for his own election in his own right. Now, the Republicans held their convention in 1964 in San Francisco, and they nominated Arizona Senator Barry Goldwater. Goldwater was born in Phoenix, Arizona in 1908, while Arizona was still a territory. It wasn't a state yet. His family owned a department store in Phoenix, and as Barry Goldwater grew up, he came to hate the New Deal and government intervention in the lives of American citizens. In World War II, he served in the United States Army Air Forces. He ferried planes to combat zones. He flew over the hump of the Himalayas to deliver these planes. After World War II, he was elected to the Phoenix City Council in 1949. In 1952, he was elected senator from Arizona, and he won election again in 1958. Now, as senator, Barry Goldwater was critical of the Eisenhower administration. He called them dime store New Deal. So basically, Barry Goldwater wants to kill the New Deal. He wants to gut it, while Eisenhower just wants to manage it better than the Democrats do. So Goldwater is a conservative. Get government out of everyone's lives. Now, Goldwater was also a supporter of civil rights. He was a member of the NAACP. He helped fund black organizations in Arizona. Sometimes he would give them money when they were struggling financially. Barry Goldwater doesn't have a prejudiced bone in his body. In 1946, he helped desegregate the Arizona Air National Guard 2 years before President Truman issued an executive order to desegregate the armed forces. Barry Goldwater helped desegregate the Senate cafeteria in 1953 when he showed up in Washington. And this is a entry from Barry Goldwater's diary from 1939, so when he was a younger man. I have always thought and have never lost sight of the thought that all men were and are created equal. This is the one statement I will make now that in the years to come I will not have to retract. I love my fellow man, be he white or black or yellow, and I am virtually interested in his well-being, for that well-being is my well-being. So Goldwater supports civil rights, but he's going to actually vote against the Civil Rights Act of 1964. For Goldwater, he basically said, I support civil rights, but I don't support a large federal government intervening in things like local schools. Basically, the best way to probably think of it is Barry Goldwater hated discrimination and racism, but he hated big government threatening your liberties even more. So he sees a big federal government as a bigger threat than violation of black civil rights. So in the 1964 election, Goldwater gets cast as the extreme candidate, and LBJ gets cast as the sane candidate. Goldwater's campaign slogan was, "In your heart, you know he's right," but then later on, Democrats added this to the slogan, "In your gut, you know he's nuts." Goldwater talked about how he wanted to go to Washington to repeal laws, not pass them. He talked about how children didn't have a right to an education funded by the federal government. He once joked, perhaps truthfully, that sometimes I think this country would be better off if we could just saw off the eastern seaboard and let it float out to sea. Goldwater does not like the eastern intellectuals that kind of try to tell the rest of America how to live. There was even an LBJ campaign commercial about cutting off the eastern seaboard. You can watch this coming up. LBJ also ran an ad showing a pair of hands tearing up a Social Security card, stating that Goldwater would get rid of Social Security. Goldwater talked about taking the fight to the communists. He said, "Our strategy must be primarily offensive. We must ourselves be prepared to undertake military operations against vulnerable communist regimes." LBJ's team ran a controversial ad that depicted Goldwater as the man who would start World War III. It was called the Daisy ad. So you can watch this here.
In a Saturday Evening Post article dated August 31st, 1963, Barry Goldwater said, "Sometimes I think this country would be better off if we could just saw off the eastern seaboard and let it float out to sea." Can a man who makes statements like this be expected to serve all the people justly and fairly? Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
On at least 7 occasions, Senator Barry Goldwater said that he would change the present Social Security system. But even his running mate, William Miller, admits that Senator Goldwater's voluntary plan would destroy your Social Security. President Johnson is working to strengthen Social Security. Vote for him on November 3rd.
These are the stakes to make a world in which all of God's children can live, or to go into the dark. We must either love each other or we must die.
Vote for President Johnson on November 3rd. The stakes are too high for you to stay home.
Hand over your heart. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America.
Оглядывайтесь, мы вас не добили под Сталинградом, на Украине, в Беларуси.
For which it stands, one nation under God, indivisible.
Против нас и будете опять готовить нападение, мы так ухнем.
And justice for all.
I want American kids to grow up as Americans, and they will, if we have the guts to make our intentions clear. So clear they don't need translation or interpretation, just respect for a country prepared as no country in all history ever was.
In your heart, you know he's right. Vote for Barry Goldwater. Don't look now, young man, but somebody has his hand in your pocket. It's the hand of big government. It's taking away about 4 months' pay from what your daddy earns every year, $1 out of every 3 in his paycheck. And it's taking the security out of your grandmother's Social Security.
You know, that's the great trouble with big inflationary government. It takes more and more of your earnings. It slowly but surely destroys individual initiative and responsibility. Government must draw its strength from the people. And as it drains away this strength, it must inevitably undermine the foundations of self-government. I ask you to join me in helping restore the individual freedoms and initiatives this nation once knew, to make government more the servant and not the master of us all. In this free nation, we do not choose to be ruled. We elect to be governed.
In your heart, you know he's right. Vote for Barry Goldwater.
Goldwater also said things like moderation in the pursuit of liberty is bad, or he said extremism in the pursuit of liberty is no vice, moderation in the pursuit of justice is no virtue. So Goldwater is seen as extreme. So LBJ runs as the peace candidate. A little bit before the election, with Vietnam kind of in the background, this is what LBJ told the American people. I have not thought that we are ready for American boys to do the fighting for Asian boys. What I've been trying to do was to get the boys in Vietnam to do their own fighting with our advice and with our equipment. A couple of weeks before the election, he said this: "We are not about to send American boys 9 or 10,000 miles away from home to do what Asian boys ought to be doing for themselves." So before the election, Goldwater says, hey, if we're in Vietnam, maybe we need to ramp up our militarism. Maybe we need to use tactical nuclear weapons. Let's let the generals win the war. LBJ says, you're crazy. Let's not escalate the war. I want to prevent another war. So LBJ is seen as the peace candidate. Now, there is a really important event that happens in August of 1964. This is called the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and we'll talk more about this when we get to the Vietnam War. But basically, on August 2nd, the destroyer Maddox, the U.S. destroyer, was attacked by North Vietnamese torpedo boats. The attack, nothing really happens. Then on August 4th, it was believed another attack occurred, but this actually never happened. There was just some miscommunication. There was never an attack on August 4th. But Johnson used this supposed attack on August 4th to get the Gulf of Tonkin resolution passed, which gave him a blank check in Vietnam. He said that this was like grandma's bathrobe. It covered everything. He ordered 5 hours of air retaliation on North Vietnam after the Gulf of Tonkin incident. One U.S. airman was killed in that air raid. So right before the election, LBJ looks tough but not crazy, and many Americans thought his response was appropriate. LBJ worried that Barry Goldwater would make him look soft on communism and blame him for losing Vietnam if something bad happened, just like the Republicans had kind of done to Harry Truman, who they said lost China. Now, the election is a huge rout for Goldwater. Johnson wins 44 states. Goldwater wins 6. Goldwater wins Arizona, and then the deep southern states of Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, and South Carolina. The reason he won those states is Barry Goldwater opposed the Civil Rights Act. He did not support segregation. He did not support racism, but he just said, I am fearful of a big government more than I am fearful of kind of racism in America. It's kind of odd. LBJ is a very racist individual. He uses the N-word all the time. He talks to his staffers using the N-word. He calls blacks that work for him the N-word. But he passes the biggest civil rights law of the 20th century. Barry Goldwater was perfectly kind, caring towards blacks and other minorities, never did anything prejudiced towards them, but he votes against this law because of what he fears will happen with big government. So you kind of have a very racist person passing a Civil Rights Act and a non-racist person opposing it. It's kind of a weird paradox, but that's what happens. Johnson wins over 61% of the vote. The Democrats hold the House of Representatives 295 to 140. They hold the Senate 68 to 32. So huge victory in 1964 for LBJ and the Democrats. One thing we'll talk about later is Ronald Reagan gets catapulted kind of to the national spotlight. He gives this very famous speech for Barry Goldwater called A Time for Choosing. Now, many people thought that this election in 1964 would kill the conservative movement in America. Basically, Republicans had kind of a moderate liberal wing, and for many years they had won the nomination for president. So people like Eisenhower and Nixon tended to be more moderate or sort of liberal versions of Republicans. Barry Goldwater wins the nomination, and he's seen as this firebrand conservative, and he gets trounced. So everybody said this is the end of conservatism. But Ronald Reagan gives his speech in 1964, and then 1980, 16 years later, he becomes president. So this kind of is the start of the conservative movement, I guess you could say, in America. There was this joke during the election. It was a pro-Goldwater joke. It went like this. They told me if I voted for Goldwater, we'd end up in a war in Vietnam. Well, I did, and we are. So even people that voted for Goldwater, you know, they were warned, you're going to vote for a warmonger and send us into war. Well, they voted for him, but it was Johnson who took America to war, not Goldwater. But we'll talk about Vietnam in another lecture. Now, after LBJ's election in 1964, he really pushes the Great Society. LBJ gives a commencement address at the University of Michigan in May of 1964, and this address is known as the Great Society speech. LBJ stated that the first part of American history was dedicated to conquering the continent. The next period of American history was dedicated to industrialization. And now this current part of American history, the 1960s, the challenge was to use that wealth from the conquering of the continent and industrialization to, quote, enrich and elevate our national life and to advance the quality of our American civilization. So let's use all our wealth to make life better for our own citizens. So he said, he also said in that speech, we have the opportunity to move not only towards the rich society and the powerful society, but upward to the great society. where the city of man serves not only the needs of the body and the demands of commerce, but the desire for beauty and the hunger for community. It is a place where men are more concerned with the quality of their goals than the quantity of their goods. That summer, LBJ established something like 135 task forces to study a lot of the social problems in America. In 1965, Congress enacted some of the most significant legislation since FDR's first term back in 1933 to 1937. LBJ gets a ton done in 1965. So this is the first year of his actual presidency where he was elected. LBJ got so much done in that year that the journalist James Reston joked that LBJ was, quote, getting everything through Congress but the abolition of the Republican Party, and he hasn't tried that yet. Now, one of the reasons Johnson was so effective is he had been a representative and a senator, so he knew how Capitol Hill worked, and he also had a very towering presence. LBJ had something that people refer to as the treatment, and you can kind of see some pictures here of LBJ giving different people the treatment. Senator George Smathers of Florida described the treatment this way: it was a great overpowering thunderstorm that consumed you as it closed in around you. So LBJ is a very tall, powerful guy. He likes to get up in your face, kind of push you backwards to show who's superior, and try to coerce you into seeing things his way. So he pushes the Great Society in 1965. In the summer of 1965, he passes legislation known as the Big Four, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, the Immigration and Nationality Act, Medicare and Medicaid, and then the Voting Rights Act. LBJ also signs into law something called the Higher Education Act later on in that year, but those four are the main ones. Now, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act was signed by Johnson at the one-room schoolhouse where he first learned to read. This law drastically increased the role of the federal government in school financing. As a result, federal expenditures for schools went up from $375 million in 1958 to $4.2 billion by 1968. Over that 10 years, the federal share of total educational spending went from 3% to 10%. So basically, the federal government put a lot more money in education. The Immigration and Nationality Act was signed by LBJ at the Statue of Liberty. Basically, this law did away with the old quota systems established during the 1920s. It encouraged more immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and immigration from Asia and Africa. Now, you can kind of see from this chart how it increases immigration throughout the 1960s, 70s, 80s, and 90s. There was only supposed to be about 290,000 immigrants per year that were to come from the United States. But in reality, some 400,000 immigrants were allowed to come each year because over 100,000 family members were allowed as a part, or in addition to that 290,000. So throughout the 1960s and 70s, about 400,000 immigrants came legally to the United States. In the 1970s, it was something like 450,000 immigrants a year. Less than 1/5 of those were from European countries. By the 1980s, some 730,000 immigrants came to the United States legally. And this is not including illegal immigration, which is also high. LBJ also signs Medicare and Medicaid into law as part of his Great Society. Medicare is essentially health insurance for the elderly, while Medicaid is health insurance for the poor. LBJ signed Medicare into law in Independence, Missouri, in front of Harry Truman. LBJ said, "No longer will older Americans be denied the healing miracle of modern medicine. No longer will illness crush and destroy the savings that they have so carefully put away over a lifetime so that they might enjoy dignity in their later years." Now, Medicare and Medicaid altered healthcare in America. By 1976, which is just 10 years after it passes, basically, 1/5 of the population used these programs, and today they're a large portion of the federal budget. The biggest thing he does for civil rights in 1965 is the Voting Rights Act. This law was passed by Congress and signed by LBJ against the backdrop of events in Selma, Alabama. Basically, civil rights leaders and activists were pushing for voter registration in Selma and other places in the South. In parts of the South, many blacks were not registered to vote. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did not fix that. In some parts of the Deep South, 90% or more of blacks in counties were not registered to vote. There was a violent clash between civil rights marchers and Alabama police on the Edmund Pettus Bridge on Sunday, March 7th, 1965. The state police attacked some 600 civil rights marchers. They beat them. They just basically went in and started attacking them. So this is going on as LBJ is trying to get the Voting Rights Act passed. Now these events shocked the nation. John L. Lewis, one of those civil rights protesters, he said this: "I don't see how President Johnson can send troops to Vietnam and can't send troops to Selma." So it's in this context that he passes the Voting Rights Act. It passes the House 333 to 85 and then the Senate 77 to 19. So overwhelming majorities in Congress support the Voting Rights Act. LBJ signs it into law on August 6, 1965, in the President's room at the Capitol, the room where Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. And this is what he said: "Let me say to every Negro in this country, you must register. You must vote. The vote is the most powerful instrument ever devised by man for breaking down injustice and destroying the terrible walls that imprison men because they are different from other men." Now, the Voting Rights Act greatly extended federal power in the nation. It was a regional measure that took aim at the Deep South, so it doesn't necessarily apply to every part of the country because every part of the country didn't have the same problems as the South as far as preventing blacks from voting. Now, the law stipulated that the Justice Department could intervene to suspend discriminatory registration tests in counties where 50% or fewer blacks had registered to vote, or just any people registering to vote. If this intervention failed, the federal government could send in people to take over the job of registering people to vote. The law covered federal, state, and local elections. Now, the law was a success. Within a year, black voter registration in 6 southern states that were where the law mainly was focused on rose from 30% to 46%. By 1967, just a couple years later, more than 50% of voting-age blacks had the franchise in the 6 most discriminatory southern states. Now, in addition to voting rights and other civil rights for blacks, LBJ also called for affirmative action for blacks. Affirmative action is just basically giving special help or preferential treatment to a group of people based on being discriminated against in the past. So basically, because of slavery and Jim Crow, LBJ thinks that blacks need to be given extra help in education, extra scholarships, priority in job hiring to kind of make up for past injustices. He kind of lays out what he thinks at a speech at Howard University in June of 1965, and he said this, and this is kind of a famous quote from his speech: "You do not take a man who, for years, has been hobbled by chains, liberate him, bring him to the starting line of a race, and say, 'You are free to compete with all the others,' and still believe you have been fair. We seek not just freedom but opportunity, not just legal equity but human ability, not just equality as a right and a theory but equality as a fact and result." Now, LBJ presses on with domestic reforms even after 1965, but 1965 is kind of the high year for liberal domestic reforms. In October 1965, he signs the Highway Beautification Act into law. This sought to regulate signs that went up along America's interstate system, and it encouraged scenic improvements along the interstate. In November 1965, LBJ signed the Higher Education Act into law. This just pumped more money into colleges and provided financial help to those who wanted to go to college. He called for Congress to pass laws such as truth in packaging, truth in lending. He called for an increase in the minimum wage, laws to improve mine safety and highway safety. He called for Congress to improve child nutrition, clean up rivers, provide rent supplement for the poor, reform the bail system, increase urban mass transit, expand low-cost housing. But Congress doesn't really do much of this. In October 1966, they do pass the Model Cities Act that basically offers money to cities for a range of programs such as improving housing, education, healthcare, crime prevention, and recreation. In April 1968, Congress passes the Open Housing Act that bans discriminatory practices in about 80% of American housing. So some stuff does get done in the late 1960s, but 1965 is the big year. The Supreme Court also passes decides a number of constitutional issues throughout the 1960s and 1970s. I won't go into all of these, but here's a list of basically some really important Supreme Court cases that were decided. You can kind of look at these, pause the video, and kind of read these and see what the court is doing. Basically, the court strikes down discriminatory practices. They pass laws that give criminals more rights or alleged criminals more rights. They pass laws against religious practices in schools, so they ban prayer in school. They ban Bible reading in school. So they do a lot of cultural things in their decisions throughout the 1960s. And basically all this reform passed by LBJ and the Supreme Court rulings, it's a top-down approach. The people in Washington are basically telling the people in America how to live their lives, and this creates a backlash. So this backlash is kind of done by what gets called the silent majority. Most Americans don't cause problems, they don't riot, they don't protest. And some things do need to be protested, such as the treatment of blacks, but people are also protesting capitalism, which provides a lot of jobs for people. So most Americans don't protest and don't cause problems. So they're the silent majority, and they kind of have a backlash against these reforms done by Washington. Average Americans oppose the permissiveness of the hippie culture. Ronald Reagan, he kind of embodies this. He once said, "A hippie is someone who dresses like Tarzan, has hair like Jane, and smells like Cheetah." Average Americans also opposed what they saw as unpatriotic anti-war movements, the rise of divorce, illegitimacy rates going up, welfare use going up, crime going up, and the removal of God and religion from schools. Average Americans, mostly in the North, also opposed court-mandated busing. Now what happens is the South gets desegregated, but a lot of places in the North were segregated not by law, just by the way people lived. Usually blacks would live in a certain part of the city, whites would live somewhere else, and so you did have segregated schools in the North, but not by law, just because these neighborhoods were wholly white and these neighborhoods were wholly black. Well, what the Supreme Court does is it rules, or higher courts as well, they rule that you have to start mixing people in different schools to get kind of an equilibrium of races in the schools. So let's say on one edge of town there's a black neighborhood, and on the other edge of town there's a white neighborhood with a white school, and this school is 100% black and this school is 100% white. What mandated busing does is it says, half of the students from this black school have to be bused all the way across town to this other school. Half of the whites from that school have to be bused all the way over across town to this black school, so we kind of have a 50-50 racial mixture. It doesn't always have to be 50-50, but that's the idea. Well, a lot of people, white and black, don't like this. There's a lot of pride taken in your local school. Parents are on local school boards. Sometimes bus trips across town are way longer than just the neighborhood school. It doesn't really make sense to most Americans, black or white, to force people to go to different schools away from where they live just in order to make it, racially diverse. So a lot of Americans oppose this. These rulings, busing, are seen as elitist. There's a famous incident where Senator Ted Kennedy, JFK and RFK's brother, he was chased by a mob because he favored busing for other people's children while he sent his own children to private school. So a lot of these liberals force busing on America, but they don't send their kids to schools that have to deal with busing. They're kind of seen as elitist, out of touch. Sometimes they get called limousine liberals because they're basically don't have to live under the laws that they pass. So after looking at all JFK and LBJ accomplished, we're kind of going to see how it comes crashing down in the year 1968. Much of the collapse of liberalism has to do with the Vietnam War, but some of it has to do with this backlash we just kind of talked about. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about the war here just to set up what happens in 1968, but we'll have a whole discussion on the Vietnam War later. But 1968 is a bad year for LBJ regarding the Vietnam War. So what ends up happening is, when we started out in Vietnam in 1963 with JFK, there's some 17,000 military advisors in Vietnam. They're not supposed to fight, but they do some fighting. LBJ Americanizes the war in 1965. In that year, he sends ground troops to actually do fighting in Vietnam. By 1968, he had escalated the war to the point where over 500,000 Americans were fighting in Vietnam. Like I said earlier, LBJ did not want to lose Vietnam to the communists. He brought General William Westmoreland home in late 1967 to basically do a public tour, tell the American people, we are winning the war. He says things like, there's light at the end of the tunnel. Just hang in there a little bit longer, America. We'll defeat the communists. We'll protect South Vietnam. So right after he gets done telling America how good it is in Vietnam, how we're about to win, the North Vietnamese launched something called the Tet Offensive. This is a huge attack in January of 1968, and basically the North Vietnamese target the major cities of the South. They attack American-held positions, the American embassy, and basically the average American looks on the TV and says, the General LBJ just told us that the war is being won, and now all of a sudden there's this huge attack and it looks like we're losing. So basically 1968 starts off poorly. The Democrats end up splitting over the war. A peace wing begins to rise up, led by Eugene McCarthy, a senator from Minnesota. He challenges LBJ in the Democratic primary. McCarthy almost beats LBJ in the first primary in New Hampshire in March of 1968. So basically the troubles with Vietnam and the uprising in his own party causes LBJ not to seek another term as president. He goes and speaks on TV in March 1968, and he says, I will not accept and I will not seek another nomination for president. So this blows the presidential race wide open on the Democratic side. A few days after LBJ's announcement, Martin Luther King Jr. is assassinated in Memphis, Tennessee. This happens in April of 1968. Riots break out across 130 cities. Property damage was estimated at more than 100 million. 20,000 people are arrested by the police. Some 46 people are killed in these riots. College students erupt in rebellion. This had been going on in the 1960s, but it happens in 1968. In April 1968, students at Columbia University seize 5 buildings and destroy papers in the president's office. They run up communist flags on 2 of the buildings, and they put up pictures of communist leaders around the school. Their actions shut down the university and caused a violent clash with police. In the end, almost 700 people are arrested. Things like this happen on college campuses all throughout America. So basically, a lot of tumult is happening in 1968, both foreign policy and domestically. After Eugene McCarthy had a strong showing against LBJ, Robert Kennedy decides to get in the race. He had wanted to stay out, but when he saw how vulnerable LBJ was, he jumps in. So Eugene McCarthy and Robert Kennedy represent the anti-war wing of the Democrat Party. LBJ's vice president throws his hat in the ring. His name is Hubert Humphrey, and he runs as the pro-war, let's finish the job in Vietnam candidate. Now, Robert Kennedy might have won the nomination, but in June 1968, after winning the California primary, he's assassinated by a young Palestinian named Sirhan Sirhan. Robert Kennedy was a supporter of Israel in its kind of struggles against the Arabs in the Middle East, so that's why he's killed. This meant that the Democratic Convention in August 1968 in Chicago would come down to the pro-war side led by Humphrey against the anti-war side led by McCarthy. It was pure chaos in Chicago, both inside and outside the convention. Thousands of anti-war protesters showed up in Chicago and clashed with police. They tried to sleep in the parks and they raised communist flags. Some protesters also threw urine on the police. Democrat Mayor Richard Daley gave the police the green light to rough up the protesters. Inside the convention hall, there was fighting on the floor. Anti-war Democrats accused Mayor Richard Daley of employing Gestapo-like tactics. Hubert Humphrey defended the police, and he ends up winning the nomination. I want to show you some clips of the violence from Chicago.
A federal investigation later concluded there had been provocations from the demonstrators, rocks, bottles, and other things thrown at police, but that the response was, in the words of the report, unrestrained and indiscriminate police violence. It was as if the normal restraints on human behavior, having been lifted in Vietnam, were slipping dangerously in this country as well. The violence of the war which divided the country was echoed by violence in the streets which divided the country further. Anti-war delegates were harassed on the floor.
What are you trying to strong-arm stuff? He's an elected delegate.
This is John Chancellor on the floor. I'm looking down at Edwin Newman in the middle of a huge bunch of security people. How did it get started? Do you know?
They keep coming around all day checking our credentials. And it's time they stop. There is nothing in the rules of the Democratic Party that says they have a right to check us every 10 minutes. They have harassed us an entire day.
The Chicago police are now in the aisles here with billy clubs, clearing people out. They're not using them on people, they're carrying them, and they're dragging everybody right out of the aisle here. It's a terrific crush. About 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. 6 policemen came in here, some of them wearing the blue helmets of the Chicago police force, and they are dragging out of here the people who were involved in this. One delegate from New York who objected to having his credentials checked.
This surely is the first time that policemen have ever entered a convention, the floor of a convention.
In the United States.
Right.
Colorado. Mr. Chairman, Colorado rises to a point of information. Is there any rule under which Mayor Daley can be compelled to suspend the police state terror perpetrated this minute on kids in front of the Conrad Hilton?
By the night of the presidential nominations, the National Guard backed up the police to keep streets clear of demonstrators. The guards used tear gas, but the police used nightsticks.
And with George McGovern as President of the United States, we wouldn't have to have Gestapo tactics in the streets of Chicago.
What are we coming to as a society? What are we coming to as a country? If policemen are treated the way they have been treated, not only in Chicago, but all over the country, on the grounds that the confrontation has to be made because we got to get the action. We got to get the violence.
It would have been impossible to hold the Democratic National Convention in any city in the United States or throughout the world without demonstrations or disruption. Daley's right on this point. Chicago just happened to be the city. It would have been impossible to hold it anywhere because the Democratic Party has blood on its hands.
By the time Vice President Humphrey won the nomination, it was a broken prize, which his co-chairman Walter Mondale could only try to restore.
The Vice President was a candidate along with the rest. We were dealt with the same as they were, and we won, I think, in a convention which is as fair as any's ever been.
The establishment kept its power and lost the election. The outsiders were left with symbolic gestures, nominating a young black from Georgia for vice president, Julian Bond, who had become a symbol of the rebellion.
Fellow delegates, the people of America are watching us now, as indeed the whole world is watching us.
1968 was a struggle between the ins and the outs left Chicago determined to take power. They did, and some of those who were bloodied in the streets then are delegates in San Francisco now.
Now, to complicate matters more, George Wallace also runs for president in 1968 as an independent, and Richard Nixon runs as a Republican. George Wallace taps into the backlash and opposition to civil rights and busing. He made a name for himself as a populist who took on elites and hippies. Once he said, "If any demonstrator ever lays down in front of my car, it'll be the last car he'll ever lay down in front of." I have a couple clips I want you to watch here. His running mate, General Curtis LeMay, was not a good choice. At one point, LeMay was asked about nuclear weapons, and he seemed to downplay the seriousness of them, so I want you to watch these clips.
who are today calling for communist victory. And they say that's free speech. But they mean free speech only if you let them speak. They don't want anybody else to speak. And I tell you,
Governor Wallace used to just love to use the long-haired hippie agitators, the folks who were out in the front lines of the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement.
I love you too, I sure do. Oh, I thought you were a she, you a he, oh my goodness.
The folks that he felt like his constituency just really disliked the most, you know.
And when he was in California, a group of anarchists lay down in front of his automobile and threatened his personal safety, the President of the United States. Well, I want to tell you, if you'll elect me the President and I go to California, or I come to Arkansas and some of them lie down in front of my automobile, it'll be the last one they'll ever want to lie down in front of.
Say again what I said in the beginning, you fellas better have your day now because you're through later on, I tell you that much.
That would be the kind of pictures that we would want.
Well, just keep on. You get me 1 million votes every time you show up, I tell you that much.
When that would be on television, and particularly back home in the South.
Come up here after I've completed my speech and I'll autograph your sandals for you.
People would just want to just leave the cotton fields early in the afternoon and get to the television and send whatever dollars they had right into the campaign headquarters. And by doing that, we were able to finance the campaign.
Why don't you young folks get out of the auditorium? And I tell you what, I may not teach you any politics if you listen, but I'll teach you some good manners. I'll teach you some good manners, you know. I'll teach you some good manners.
Setting the woods on fire.
War is horrible. Doesn't make much difference to me if I have to go to war and get killed in the jungle of Vietnam with a rusty knife, or get killed with a nuclear weapon. As a matter of fact, if I had the choice, I'd lean towards a nuclear weapon.
General LeMay hasn't advocated the use of nuclear weapons, not at all. He discussed nuclear weapons with you. He's against the use of nuclear weapons, and I am too. So, Mr. Nelson, he hasn't said anything about the use of nuclear weapons.
I'd rather die as a result of a nuclear bomb than a rusty knife. Well, a man who doesn't understand the difference for humanity between a rusty knife and a nuclear bomb has got no business being within 1,000 miles of the presidency.
Now, Richard Nixon runs as the law and order candidate in 1968. He also taps into the backlash, not necessarily against civil rights, but against government overreach, which would include things like busing. His campaign would try and reach out to the South in something that was later called a Southern strategy, basically getting Democrat voters in the South who were angry with the party over civil rights to kind of vote for Republicans. Now, Nixon did not promise to roll back civil rights. In fact, he actually increases affirmative action on a scale unthought of by LBJ. So there's kind of this myth that the Democrats had always been the party of slavery and Jim Crow, and the Republicans, the party of Lincoln, had opposed slavery and Jim Crow. And then in the 1960s, the party switched. The Democrats became the party of civil rights and equality, whereas the Republicans became the party of segregation. This isn't true. Basically, the Democrat Party ended up somewhat changing during the 1960s and supported civil rights, but the Republicans had always reported civil rights, like we saw earlier. Those civil rights laws, 80% of Republicans supported them, while only 60-some% of Democrats supported them. So Nixon is just trying to be smart politically. He knows the South is kind of disaffected with all this reform from Washington, so he says maybe we can get their votes. But that doesn't mean that Nixon institutes Jim Crow again. He doesn't do anything like that. He goes the opposite direction. I want to read you this quote from Nixon during the 1968 campaign. "The new voice that is being heard across America today, it is not the voice of a single person. It's the voice of a majority of Americans who have not been the protesters, who have not been the shouters. The great majority finally have become angry, not angry with hate, but angry, my friends, because they love America and they don't like what has been happening to America for the last 4 years." Nixon also talks about how he has a secret plan to win the war in Vietnam. He says, "When the strongest nation in the world can be tied down for years in a war in Vietnam with no end in sight, when the nation with the greatest tradition of the rule of law is plagued by unprecedented lawlessness, when a nation that's been known for a century for equality of opportunity is torn by unprecedented racial violence, then it's time for new leadership for the United States of America." Nixon visits Chicago a few days after the Democratic convention. Hundreds of thousands of people come out to see him, and there's no violence. It's a very patriotic parade, a very law and order type of parade. So basically, Americans on TV a few days earlier had seen the Democrats erupt in chaos in Chicago. Nixon shows up a few days later with the Republicans, and everything is calm and peaceful and kind of happy. So that kind of paints the mood for the election. Now, Nixon wins the election of 1968. Electorally, it's a landslide. He wins 32 states and 301 electoral votes. Hubert Humphrey wins 13 states plus Washington, D.C. for 191 electoral votes. And then George Wallace wins some of the Deep South, 5 states with 46 electoral votes. Now, blacks supported Hubert Humphrey something like 97%, but many blue-collar workers and whites disaffected with all this reform supported Nixon. So some of the New Deal coalition holds, but not all of it. Now, Democrats still control the House, 245 to 187, and the Senate, 57 to 43. So Nixon wins the presidency, but the Democrats still control Congress. Now, I want to spend just a few minutes talking about LBJ's legacy, especially with civil rights. Now, LBJ dies January 22nd, 1973. This is just 5 days before the Paris Peace Accords are signed. That's what ends the war in Vietnam. So LBJ did not live to see the end of the war that he couldn't win, the war that brought down his presidency. And basically, LBJ is remembered for 3 things: civil rights, the war on poverty, and Vietnam. Regarding the Vietnam War, LBJ is easy to understand. He was a cold warrior who wanted to use American power to stop the spread of communism. But LBJ was always wanted to focus on domestic affairs. He did not want to focus on foreign affairs. LBJ grew up a New Dealer, so his war on poverty and his Great Society makes sense. He believed the federal government could be used to make people's lives better. I got a couple quotes to kind of show you how he preferred to fight a domestic war on poverty instead of Vietnam. He said, "If I left the woman I really loved, the Great Society, in order to get involved with that bitch of a war on the other side of the world, then I would lose everything at home. But if I left the war and let the communists take over South Vietnam, then I would be seen as a coward and my nation would be seen as an appeaser." He also later said, "That bitch of a war killed the lady I loved, the Great Society." So LBJ wanted to focus more on domestic issues, but Vietnam just pulls him in, and that's kind of what he's known for. Now, LBJ's support for civil rights is more difficult to understand. He was a lifetime racist. Many people that worked with him and supported him acknowledged this fact, both black and white. LBJ once asked his chauffeur, Robert Parker, a black man, whether he would prefer to be called boy or the N-word or chief. Parker said that he would just like to be called by his name, and then LBJ kind of shot back at him. He said this: "As long as you're black, you're going to be black till the day you die. No one's going to call you by your GD name. So no matter what you are called, N-word, you just let that roll off your back like water and you'll make it. Just pretend like you're a GD piece of furniture." So there's kind of this question: how does an infamous racist come to sign the most important civil rights legislation of the 20th century? There's basically 2 views about LBJ. One is that, yes, he did grow up racist, but he changed his ways when he was a senator and president, and then he passes the most important civil rights laws of the 20th century. This argument says that he underwent a moral transformation on the issue of race. LBJ supporters support this view about LBJ or this interpretation. Others say that LBJ was always a racist, but he knew that blacks were going to get their civil rights no matter what. So it made sense to give them a little so they would remain within the Democratic Party. In their mind, or in this interpretation, LBJ didn't really care about civil rights or blacks. He just cared about political power. The first view that LBJ had a moral transformation would make sense if you could point to that time or that place where the transformation took place, but nobody's pointed to that yet. The second view actually makes more sense when you study some of LBJ's other statements. In 1957, when the Civil Rights Act of that year was getting passed, LBJ told Mississippi Senator John Stennis, "Let's face it, our ass is in a crack. We're going to have to let this N-word bill pass." LBJ once told Georgia Senator Richard Russell during the debate over that law, the 1957 Civil Rights Act, he said, "These Negroes, they're getting pretty uppity these days, and that's a problem for us since they've got something they never had before, the political pull to back up their uppityness. Now we've got to do something about this. We've got to give them a little something, just enough to quiet them down, not enough to make a difference." Once when talking about support for the Civil Rights Act of 1964, LBJ told two governors, quote, "I'll have the N-words voting Democrat for 200 years. So basically, LBJ, one view is he had a moral transformation and threw away his old views and supported civil rights. The other view is that he never changed. He did use racist language all throughout his life, even after he was senator and president. So basically, that view holds. He just knew that civil rights was going to happen no matter what, so you might as well kind of co-opt it and keep blacks within your New Deal kind of voting block. And so those are kind of the two views about him. So next time we'll kind of get into Richard Nixon in the 1970s.